Welcome, everyone, to this special edition of Under the Influence. Jim Henson, the magic, the Muppets, and the Disney deal that never was. Why Jim Henson? It seemed like the perfect time to not just talk about my personal connection to Jim Henson, but to take a moment and honor the legacy of the man. Muppet Vision 3D is going away, and there really is not much at the moment in our culture that honors not just Jim Henson, but the Muppets as a whole.
There's big game hunting in Africa, fella.
Big game hunting?
Yes, indeed.
Oh, what game?
Monopoly.
Growing up, the Muppets were everywhere, and I can think of so many ways that the Muppets impacted my childhood and even my life today. Growing up in Bucks County, Pennsylvania, Sesame Place was not just a local place, but also a rite of passage as a first job. Not only did I work there, but I may have been friends with a couple characters.
With our new neighborhood, the fun never ends. It's a new place to play.
Sesame Neighborhood. Take Route 1 to Oxford Valley exit. Sesame Place, Langhorne, Pennsylvania.
And by the time I got to college, I would wind up interning for the Jim Henson Company as a junior. They were located on the east side of Manhattan in the Muppet Mansion, which was quite the experience because not only did I get to see where Jim worked, I got to hear stories firsthand from folks that worked with him on projects like Muppets Take Manhattan and Sesame Street. I was even taught how to build the first Joe Coconut by a woman who ran the Muppet Workshop. So the Muppets, Jim Henson, and everything that comes with the Jim Henson legacy means so much to me personally that I thought I would take the time on this episode to honor the legacy of Jim Henson, share his story with you, share some clips perhaps you've never seen before, but also talk about the deal that never was and what could have been. So this is Jim Henson, the magic, the Muppets, and the Disney deal that never was.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1, cue.
James Maury Henson was born September 24th, 1936 in Greensville, Mississippi. It wouldn't be long before his family would uproot him and move towards Maryland, where he would find his way in local television by the time he was in high school.
You went into puppetry just as a way to get into television?
Because I wanted to work in this field. I loved it.
And you made your first puppets just in order to audition?
I got a job, and they put me on, and I had a show for a little while.
And by the time he was off to college, Jim had fully immersed himself in the world of puppetry. He was enrolled at the University of Maryland as a graphic design major, and this would be the moment when he would first create Sam and Friends.
I was going through those sort of early times in one's life, and I was breaking up with a girl and that sort of thing, so I decided to go away and paint for a year. So I went to Europe, and I wandered around, and I met a lot of other puppeteers. And in the course of that little trip, I found that when people were doing interesting things, and it was something that you could get into and develop.
Sam and Friends was a 5-minute show that appeared on local television, and while it was not the Muppets, the early signs were there, including what was the first representation of Kermit the Frog.
When she's happy how she plays, she rolls her eyes for days and days and vibrates and yodels.
And it was when Jim Henson met Jane Nebel that they would forge a creative partnership and a collaboration that would not only lead to the success of Sam and Friends, but a marriage in 1959.
I think Jim's enthusiasm about things was very contagious all the time, and it really energized people. Jim was not really basically a rule breaker. He was not a rebel, but he always saw the rules and the systems and everything else that were being handed out as being, a little questionable and a little absurd. And like, oh, really? That's how it is?
The success of Sam and Friends would lead to a variety of other business opportunities. And it was the partnership that Jim Henson and Jane Nebel forged together that would pave the way for the Muppets.
Sam and Friends is brought to you by
Ask her.
At this point, Jim was seeking to expand puppetry, deviating from traditional marionetting to a more rod and arm form and leaning into fabric and felt design. This would be the early style for the Muppets.
Sometimes I think Matt takes this chess game too seriously.
I play chess too, you know.
Before the age of 30, Jim Henson had found success in local television, puppetry, and was already on his way to developing new techniques that would pave the way for the Muppets we know and love. By 1961, Sam and Friends had gone off the air, and Jim and Jane ventured into commercials.
Put your money in here and you get a cup of Wilkins coffee.
I don't want any.
Then push that button. How about a cup of Wilkins? Got your parachute?
I forgot it.
How about the Wilkins coffee?
I forgot that too.
You'll never forget this.
Jim Henson, of course, had much bigger ambitions than making commercials with puppets. He was striving for something no one else had ever done before.
The things that we do best are visual. We do, since the puppets themselves, they work symbolically. They're little symbolic representations of life.
He had also began dabbling in filmmaking with the 1965 experimental short Timepiece, which actually earned him an Academy Award nomination. So now at this point in his young career, Jim Henson was a puppeteer, a producer, an artist, and a filmmaker. It was 1969 when a group of producers would approach Jim Henson for a concept that would ultimately become Sesame Street.
I think we need to be very careful about the attitudes that children see on television. And of course, we all know how awful television is in general. I don't need to go into that, right?
The show's creators were looking to use television at the time as a means for education, and they thought Jim Henson's puppets were the perfect way to get the job done.
And you see TV as a means of doing this in part, at least.
Yeah, right. It's a conveyor of attitudes and so forth.
Henson and his team went on to create some of TV's most beloved children's characters, like Big Bird, Oscar the Grouch, Bert, Ernie, Cookie Monster, and Grover.
So fuzzy and...
I'm never going to eat cookies in my bed again.
Okay, good. What are you doing?
I'm going to eat cookies in your bed, Bert.
Ernie and Bert have this funny relationship that has developed over the years. And it has something to do with Frank and I.
The relationship with Jim and I didn't happen right away. I was 19. I was a kid. But what Jim did is he took away the proscenium and he made the television screen the proscenium. And he could do that because he decided to have a camera next to the camera shooting him, and the camera next to the camera would have a video feed to a monitor so he could see what he was doing, and therefore he knew where he was in that proscenium.
And with the help of those characters, Sesame Street would premiere on November 10th, 1969.
How to get to Sesame Street.
The show was a massive success, and it would change the future of children's television programming forever.
It's not unlike the way a parent, no matter what you do as a parent, anytime you're sort of talking with your kids, you're really teaching them, all the time you're talking, you're conveying your feelings about life, and that's really that kind of thing that we're trying to do.
Right there, you see, Charlotte is next to Fanny. So they are next to each other. Now, Kermit the Frog is next to Charlotte.
I know that.
It's been my experience that the character himself is really what's interesting. That if I'm sitting here working Kermit, which I've done on the Carson show and things like that, that people don't really pay attention to me,
How's your love life?
What? How's my love life?
How's your love life?
Listen, I work on Sesame Street. You don't ask a frog questions like that.
Henson had an instant success on his hands, and his early creativity had paid off tenfold.
The fact that I've done him for so long, and he's very much a part of me. We originally we were not going to use him on Sesame Street, but people there putting the show together really wanted him as part of the show, and so we said, okay, he can be part of it as long as he can also do other things.
Point, I love my elbows. Yeah, they're my favorite joint.
Sesame Street had made the Muppets a household name.
What's your name? Carol Spinney.
Big Bird was created to act out the emotions of a small child, being able to make the mistakes that kids make.
And Carol also does Oscar on the show.
Oscar, again, was sort of created again to be able to handle the hostility that kids feel and sort of negative, angry emotions, and be an outlet for it, so that kids could see this and see that it's okay to feel this way.
Frank Oz. And Frank has been with me probably longer than any other puppeteer, 8 years, 8 or 9 years. And Frank does Bert and Cookie Monster and Grover and Herbert Bird's Foot.
No, I don't do Herbert.
Not Herbert Bird's Foot.
Are you Jim Henson?
Jim had bigger ambitions.
He felt like Sesame Street had pigeonholed him, and it was frustrating to him.
Jim Henson was in Toronto recently, not for Sesame Street, but to produce a children's special, Emmett Otter's Jug Band Christmas. We took the opportunity, not only to talk with this Walt Disney of our time, but to see how he puts a show together.
There's something about a small, inanimate thing, giving it life, that's appealing.
His idea was always to be more experimental, and as a filmmaker, that's what he wanted to do. We talked about it, that this is not where he wants to be with Sesame Street, but he'll go with it because he sees value in it, and out of that value could come other value.
He wanted to create the Muppet Show, but nobody would take on the project. Henson repeatedly faced rejection and could not get the show off the ground. And before ever finding that success with the Muppet Show, Jim had a short-lived stint with the Muppets on Saturday Night Live.
Oh, sweetheart.
What are you doing?
Excuse me, ma'am. I was just on my way to the mighty Fava.
Unfortunately, the Land of Gorch was a complete flop. Henson blamed it on creative differences with the writing staff, who didn't understand how to utilize the Muppet-like characters.
Nobody had ever seen anything like those characters.
I remember seeing the first, 2 or 3 shows with going, what in the heck is this? Because I was looking for Kermit.
However, most failure comes with a learning lesson, and you can clearly see here where the characters from Land of Gorch would inspire future projects like Labyrinth and the Dark Crystal. At this point, Henson was lucky enough to meet a British television mogul by the name of Lou Grade. Lou had a complete understanding of Jim's vision for the Muppets and was ready to invest.
You just can't simply go by words. If you read a script, you can't just go by the words that the script say. You have to visualize what can happen.
This uprooted the entire Henson team to London, where the Muppet Show would begin production.
It's the Muppet Show!
The Muppet Show was chaotic, it was fast-paced, high energy, and it was something people had not seen before.
I'm going to make it look good up there. It has to be uncomfortable down here.
There was a scene where Piggy was supposed to slap Kermit. And in rehearsals, I don't quite know why I did it, but instead of slapping him, I karate chopped him.
Puppets were not just for kids anymore. And in 1976, when the Muppet Show premiered, Jim Henson had done it again. By season 2, the Muppet Show had become a massive global success, racking up Emmy wins and attracting celebrities who were flocking to have a guest appearance on the show.
All right.
The world had fallen in love with characters like Kermit the Frog, Miss Piggy, Fozzie Bear, Gonzo, Statler, and Waldorf. But Jim Henson still had his eye on something bigger. The movies. By 1979, the Muppets had made their way to Hollywood. The Muppet movie premiered, and it was a game changer. The magic of the Muppets had made for a massive box office success. and Henson had broken new ground with technical achievements like the Muppets riding bikes and the use of animatronics. This was puppetry in a way people had never seen before. The past chaotic variety show format had been traded for a linear storyline, and of course, who could forget the Rainbow Connection?
What's so amazing that keeps us stargazing? And what do we think we might see?
By 1981, Henson had sought to expand the Muppets' cinematic footprint with the release of The Great Muppet Caper. A shift in tone, while it was a hit, it was not the same global success of the initial film release.
This is the most fabulous diamond of them all, the legendary baseball diamond. And this would be the most sensational heist of the century if it weren't for...
Ta-da! Announcing The Great Muppet Caper.
It's a new Muppet movie.
With what? Your superstar. Say cheese.
But that ultimately wouldn't matter, because the Muppets were huge. And by the third film, Jim and the Muppets were back in their comfort zone, the theater.
I just can't imagine that you've ever been gone. It's not starting over, it's just going on.
Do you, Froggy, take this pig to be your lawful wedded wife until you die?
Well, kind of makes you sick, doesn't it?
1984, The Muppets Take Manhattan are a return to form. The film was a hit, striking an emotional chord with audiences, celebrating the themes of friendship and perseverance. It would also be the jumping-off point for what we would know as the Muppet Babies. By the 1970s, Henson was at the peak of his career. He had dominated television and film, and the Muppets were household names around the globe. So what was next? When Jim Henson was approached by George Lucas to create a character for Empire Strikes Back, Henson stated he was just too busy, but if he spoke to Frank Oz, Jim's other half, he was certain Frank would help him.
What he wanted to do was something he didn't know he could do. He wrote something down with Larry, a character, a small character. How do you bring that character to life? Stuart Freebaum made the character with the help of Jim Henson. Other people made the clothing. Other people did the shots. What I did is I put it all together. And then I made something come alive.
Jim Henson was ready to prove that puppetry could move beyond the light, fluffy tone of Muppetry and expand into darker worlds. One night, holed up in a hotel room during a storm, he would jot down the storyline for what would be the Dark Crystal on the back of a napkin.
The story wasn't really defined until Jim and Cheryl got stuck in a blizzard at JFK.
We stuck there for a couple of days, and it allowed my dad the time to actually think through a lot of the ideas that he had brewing in his head.
And with the concept designs of the legendary Brian Fraggle,
we're just exploring possibilities of characters. I was sketching first, and then I made little models of the Skeksis and the Mystics.
Henson would go on to design an immersive world.
What we're doing here is an entirely different kind of a thing. The entire film is, well, you can tell just by the look of these things that it's not related at all to the Muppet.
You see, when we work with these characters, we're creating our own stars. We're making our own movie stars.
Trial by stone. Trial by stone!
Upon release, the film was met with mixed criticism. Some thought it was too dark and too complex. However, it ultimately did develop a cult following and even a Netflix series follow-up in 2019.
Was not a huge success. It hurt him.
I remember going to a screening at Universal with the executives for the first time, showing them Dark Crystal. And the movie went on for an hour and a half, whatever it took. And the movie went off. It was dead silence. The executives walked out the room, didn't say a thing to Jim or me. And he really felt lousy then. They just stood up and walked out. Not a word was spoken after 2-3 years in this movie.
Henson's next project would be something lighter, something that would be ambitious in its own right in spreading a message of unity around the world.
He convened a group of 20 or so people in London. And Jim actually said at that meeting, as Jim could do, let's do a children's show that brings peace to the world. He actually said that. And we, who had been around him for a long time, took it at face value and said, oh, all right, well, sure. You know?
Fraggle Rock was a mix of music, comedy, and social commentary. Again, Henson was doing something people had never seen before.
Fraggle Rock became a sort of environmental metaphor show in which different species lived, sometimes in harmony and sometimes in disharmony. Species that were interdependent on each other, but without fully realizing how interdependent.
The show followed three interconnected societies: the fun-loving Fraggles, the hard-working Doozers, and of course the Fraggle chasing gourds. The show was one of the first international co-productions of a children's program, and would go on to be adapted for audiences worldwide. With another success under his belt, Henson would go back to cinema with a lighter return to a darker world.
And then we've started working on our next fantasy film, which will not, we won't shoot that until 85 for release in 86. So there are always a few things.
Released in 1986, Labyrinth was an adventure filled with fantasy, music, and puppetry, starring Jennifer Connelly and David Bowie.
He first brought me the concept on the 1983 tour that I did in America, and asked me if I'd consider doing the part. And he showed me Brian Frown's artwork, and he showed me a copy of The Dark Crystal, which I found a fascinating piece of work.
And I said, you know, if you like the script on something like this, would you consider being Jareth and singing and writing the songs for him and so forth? And David liked the whole thing from the beginning.
I could see the potentiality of making that kind of movie with humans, with songs, with a more of a lighter comedy script.
It did not find success at first, but ultimately over time, it found its way. Sadly, it would be the last feature film he directed before passing away.
We shot the puppets first with a computerized camera, and then we removed the black velvet and shot the background using the computer to make the camera move at exactly the same speed and so forth. And all of these elements were put together later in the laboratory.
Jim Henson's impact was much bigger than the Muppets. The mythical tone and the dark creatures set in Henson's fantasy worlds may have not initially resonated with audiences, but they would spawn the formation of the Jim Henson Creature Shop. What Jim was doing behind the scenes would have a lasting impression on filmmaking. Henson's desire to secure a future for the Muppets became a reality in the early 80s. He knew that the natural fit would be the Walt Disney Company, but striking a deal wouldn't be as easy as he had hoped.
There are all those layers of bureaucracy that begin to build up, even in a little funny organization or disorganization like ours.
He told me, he just didn't want to do that anymore. He wanted to just create.
Disney was going to take over all that stuff.
My dad had a great relationship with Michael Eisner. They had known each other for many years.
He was looking for protection for his characters, knew that I cared desperately about the quality of his work, knew that I understood his work, and that Disney would protect his work forever.
Jim was a tremendous admirer of Walt Disney and what he accomplished.
My father kind of thought it was pointless to be in any theme park other than the Disney parks because they were the best.
He looked forward to a company that would be financing all new products and new movies, and he loved the parks.
We were starting to work on projects as though the deal had been done.
He was getting to play in the third dimension. We were going to make more movies and television shows. He was going to be treated well financially.
Then came a terrible negotiation period. Then came the lawyers.
He was trying to make something work, but he had to make it work for himself, for the characters, for the Muppets, and for the people around him, and it wasn't working.
He said something about the goddamn deal, referring to the Disney negotiations, and I was rocked when he said that, because for him to say the goddamn deal was like anybody else letting off with a 10-minute stream of expletives.
It's time to spice up your kitchen with Pampered Chef. Pampered Chef has all the goodies from spatulas, mandolins, and amazing pots and pans, not to mention knives. Plus, don't miss out on small appliances like the deluxe air fryer and coffee maker. Spice up your kitchen today. Go to pamperedchef.com/PWS/Colleen Herman. pamperedchef.com/PWS/Colleen Herman. And with no estate plan, you could be leaving those you love the most with high taxes, probate fees, and an incomplete or divided estate and legal fights and fees. If you live in Florida, contact RK Law for a free consultation to discuss the options you have and the tools available to protect your home, savings, and estate for those you love the most. To get started, send an email to russell@rklawpro.com or call 786-566-2456 to set up your consultation today. That's russell@rklawpro.com. And if you're in the market for a 3D printer, visit flashforge.com. With printers starting at under $300, you can begin your 3D adventures today. Visit flashforge.com. And while you're online, head over to Etsy and the Theme Park Factory. The Theme Park Factory on Etsy is a great way to support this channel. Pick up a Joe Coconut and bring a little bit of the Theme Park Factory to your home.
Miss Piggy and Kermit the Frog will soon be neighbors to Mickey and Minnie in the Magic Kingdom. Yesterday, the Muppets danced on stage over news that Walt Disney bought Henson Associates, giving Disney exclusive rights to Henson's colorful characters. Henson describes the sale as a dream come true.
It's so much. And the idea of joining our characters with these guys is such a big thrill for me.
Much more the creative and less the businessman. This is where things started to get a little too stressful for Jim.
The Muppet creator will also use his musical talents to create new characters for Disney. As for Mickey and Minnie, they say they look forward to the Muppets joining the gang.
Mickey Mouse has good taste. He's only more popular and will be more popular because he's being seen with the right people.
He was worn down. His system, I think, was not as strong during this time period, and he got sick. But I think he wouldn't have gotten as sick had he not been worn down by the deal that much.
Came home and was sick, but he didn't want a doctor. That he called Jane to come in and stay with him. They were about to get a divorce, which showed you that he was scared in some way at bottom.
Jim and I shared an assistant, and I came in and I said, "Where's Jim?" And she said, "He's in the hospital. He's got a bad flu." And I said, "Oh, okay." But then she said he's in intensive care. And I said, "Wait a second." I was thinking to myself, something's wrong.
What do you mean? It's by the hospital.
You know, if he'd only gotten to the hospital 2 hours earlier, he would have been saved.
The phone rang, and it was Frank Oz. And he said, "Joan, Jim is dead." And I had a hard time staying on my feet. I would vacillate between profound grief and then anger of why didn't you do the sensible thing? But it was all too late.
It's not that easy being green, having to spend the day the color of the leaves.
We were doing Saturday Night Live, the first year of Saturday Night Live. Jim and I and a few others of the gang were doing some puppets there. And it was before Christmas, and it was just prior to dress rehearsal. The other guys had gone away to have lunch or something. So Jim and I were hanging around the halls. And as I recall, it was the hallway, Jim came up with a camera. And he said in his own quiet, enthusiastic way, he said, "Frank, I need to go in the dressing room with you, and if you could take off all your clothes so I could take a picture of you naked." I said, "Whoa." I said, "What?" He said, "I really need to do this. I need to take some photos of you naked." We discussed this for a while. I said, "Okay. All right." So we went in the dressing room, and I took off all my clothes, buck naked. Locked the door, of course, and he told me how to pose. He said, put your hands over your genitals, which I was glad to do. Bend over like this and look into the camera in a state of shock, which was not difficult at that time. So I bent over and I looked like that, and he took some photos of me naked. Okay, no problem. I got dressed, we did the show. It was Christmas time. He gave me a gift. The gift was about this large. I have it. And the gift, I'll describe it to you. It's difficult. It's more like made of some of Bert's toys, and it was a wall-hanging sculpture kind of thing, about this big. And it was a head of Bert, and Bert's arms are holding a ledge. And on the ledge are about a dozen little Berts, tiny Berts you can buy in the stores at that time, about 1.5 inches high. And you could turn them in different directions, looking over there, and looking back at the big Bert's head while the big Bert was looking down at the little Berts. And on that ledge, underneath the Berts, were faces, photographs that Jim obviously took of many of the shop people, the workshop people, several of which were responsible in the making of Bert, and certainly all of which were responsible in the making of the Muppets. And they were all looking up the camera, and their little faces, about that big, all along the top of the ledge. On the edge of this wooden ledge, Jim had painted layers, like earth striations, which were really, I gather, layers of Bert's mind, layers of his soul. By the way, I do Bert to Jim's Ernie. And within those layers, the striations, he painted textures, beautiful little textures. And then I noticed Bert's eyes, the large Bert's eyes the pupils were cut out. And you look inside Bert's brain, and there I am, naked, looking at this. I knew he had a good reason.
6,000 people showed up. We were all just shattered.
The loss was so great that I think we just didn't accept it at that time. Our job was to honor him. And I think that carried us through.
I remember this Jim Henson fella. Oh, yeah? Yeah, he was always hanging around.
Where?
Down there.
We'll be seeing you soon with more Muppet stuff, because that's the way the boss would want it.
As a family, we asked Disney to continue on the tradition of the Muppets. As a family, we put a lot of things into the hands of Sesame Street. My dad's legacy is being put in a number of museums.
Jim has a legacy like Charles Schulz has a legacy, like Walt Disney has a legacy. It's the characters that he left behind.
When Jim Henson and Michael Eisner finally decided to do that deal, there was a caveat, and the caveat was no Sesame Street. Sesame Street's a deal breaker. Jim would not part with it. He thought that it was sacred.
You know, particularly the Sesame characters, and Kermit with his connection to Sesame Street, thus has kind of won a place with the children. And once he has that position, you can't take advantage of it.
So there was a lot of strain there because Eisner kept pushing. And when you see that announcement, it was not a papered deal. It was a handshake at that point. So there was a lot of strife and a lot of fallout, and ultimately the Muppets were sold to EMTV for a large sum of money. I do believe it was over $600 million. And EMTV, a German company, wanted to use the Muppets to sell things like Mercedes, so they saw the Muppets as sort of a return to Jim's advertising days.
Now that his Muppets have made the big time, Henson is under pressure to let them advertise products. So far, and we can be thankful for this, Henson has resisted such pressures.
Here's what goes wrong there. They completely cooked their books. So now EMTV winds up selling the Muppets back to the Henson family for something like 10% of that deal. I was there during that time, and I walked in, and I looked to the woman who I was working with in publishing, and I said, "Who bought us?" And she said, "We did." And because I didn't understand what was going on, and I don't think anybody really did. It was a very confusing time. And then finally, the Henson family sold the Muppets to Disney. Finally, that deal got done the second time around for something around like $70 million, right? So eventually, Eisner got the Muppets. He didn't get the Sesame Street characters. Henson got his way, and that's where the Children's Television Workshop would take ownership and become the Sesame Workshop. All right, so much like Walt Disney, one of the things Jim Henson was able to do was to take something that was otherwise an inanimate object and to breathe life into it. You know, Walt was an innovator. Walt innovated feature-length animation. Nobody thought that you could evoke emotion out of animation. And Jim did many of those same things with the Muppets. So by the time you get to movies like The Dark Crystal and Labyrinth, puppets had become creatures, hence the creature shop, right? Puppets were no longer just that Muppet felt that Jim had originally broken through with.
Jim created characters that you could put a new nose on. You can put a new eye on.
There's a distinct difference between what Muppets presented to the culture.
Jim created a whole new form. Puppets used to be a prince, a princess, a king.
Than what you may have seen in the early days of something like a Howdy Doody or a Gumby or even a Lamb Chop.
He experimented in the beginning with hard puppets, but then he ended up doing softer puppets with foam and fabric covering.
And despite finally having the Muppets, Disney didn't know what to do with them.
And it's also weird because it's like buying a thoroughbred and not letting them race.
Yeah. And I can think of that clip where Michael Eisner said, well, Mickey keeps good company.
Mickey Mouse has good taste. He's only more popular and will be more popular because he's being seen with the right people.
And the opportunities were endless. There was some further merchandising of the Muppets. There were some shows and some usage of the characters in the parks, but we never saw any further rides. We never saw any real utilization of the Muppets from that point forward. There was a lot of promise, but nothing really coalesced. And I think what happens with a company the size of Disney, and I don't think you can point the fault to any one person, but a company that large takes a look at characters like that, and they see them as pieces of intellectual property that function inside of a machine. The Muppets aren't just puppets. There's a personality and there's a soul that comes with the relationship between the performer and the character. And if you don't have an understanding of what is so special about that collaborative performance, then you don't understand where the essence comes from. The reason that works is because there is a very talented orchestra of individuals underneath those puppets.
Quality is one of those things that it comes from talented people. You know, you get good people, you get good writers.
I mean, but the thing about these characters, you know, they wouldn't exist if we didn't work the way we did. The characters could not be popular without us down below. We know each other for so many years.
Yeah.
You can't just bring a new guy in.
Right.
You just can't do it.
And when you look at something like The Dark Crystal and you look at something like Labyrinth and you look at how the level of organization below the surface, how that actually impacted the performances up top, that's how you get that's the difference between sloppy puppetry and what Jim was able to accomplish.
Basically, what it takes is a lot of rehearsing and getting to know each other, getting to know each other's timing. So that when I go, here, you know, something like that, the eyes go, here, you know, and Sherry goes, here, and, you know, everybody does it at the same time.
It's horrible! Because he was the most complicated character. We were trying to do more with him, and he had to be virtually the second lead in the film.
And some of the puppets just wiggle. I mean, and they think it's good. Other puppets there are absolutely brilliant if you see the right ones.
5 performers trying to get one character out of one puppet. It's a very tough thing.
It is the collaborative performance that elevates what those puppets are doing. And obviously, no corporation's going to understand the value of that.
The thing is, what they don't understand is that one can't just write for the Muppets. There are performers who've been with Jim for decades.
Yeah.
And they're not being part of the process. They know the soul. I just wish they would be asked to be part of the creation.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what would make a success for Disney, really. So I have nothing against Disney. Jim wanted to go to Disney.
Right.
Absolutely.
You know, I remember one of the stories is Jim was a hippie. You know, Jim wasn't a businessman. Jim was a hippie and a creative. And he wouldn't pay his electric bill. And he would say, what are they going to do? We're making millions of dollars. They're going to turn the lights off on us. You know, and so Jim was inherently rebellious. And the Muppets were rebellious.
They're very sweet now. Their job is to be rebellious. Their job is to say, screw Disney. They're different. They're not the Muppets that Jim had intended. To me, I love cute things like little bunny rabbits, but I don't like pejorative cute. They're cute. There's no conflict as much as in the relationships as there should be. That's what Jerry Jewell did so well when he wrote. And Jim, we were all entwined like a funny O'Neill play.
There was an attempt to revive the Muppets at some point with Jason Segel. Now, I'll be very honest with you. I, to this day, have not watched those movies. I have a hard enough time watching anything with Kermit that doesn't have something that resembles Jim's voice, even if it isn't Jim. And when I look at those or anything that Disney attempted to do from that point beyond, it's just hard for me because it doesn't capture the essence of the brand.
That we all had chains to our chests, and every time we moved, and that is fascinating. And there was anarchy amongst that, and it's become sweet. And so that I feel sad about that. At the same time, I'm thrilled that people can see the Muppets again.
And you could say, well, hey, you know what? It's time to move on. But the problem I have, Disney has never approached Frank Oz about working on the Muppets. Jim Henson and the Muppets impacted my childhood in so many different ways. I grew up watching Sesame Street, Fraggle Rock, of course, the classic Muppets. I was always watching the behind-the-scenes videos more than the actual shows. And I would watch the Fraggle Rock footage and see how they were using these little foam mouths to control the doozers.
Jim wanted these little guys to be puppeteered very much the same as you would puppeteer a normal like a Kermit.
I was enamored by this.
Oh, hello. You see the little mouth.
And then you get to the Dark Crystal, and you get to Labyrinth, and you see how they're using that kind of tech to control Hoggle and all of the other animatronics. It was mind-blowing to me that you could use a remote control to bring something like this to life. The idea that you didn't have to put a hand in the puppet, you could put your hand in a remote puppet and control a smaller puppet, it was incomprehensible to me as a child.
And so they had this, open and closed mouth kind of mitten that you've got here, which they called the Waldo, and we still do call it a Waldo.
And for Jim, that still wasn't enough.
Do you recall seeing one of these before?
Sure. That's the electronic mitten thing you use to run the radio-controlled puppets like the doozers.
That's where Muppet Vision 3D comes from and the birth of Waldo, because Jim was finding new ways to control the puppets.
But in this case, what we're doing is we're using it to create the picture of Waldo on the computer screen over there.
That's where he starts to push through on 3D animation. And for him, 3D animation was just a form of controlling the puppets. He saw Waldo as a virtual puppet.
But you see, what we can do is we can take this crummy-looking low-resolution picture, and we can run it through yet another computer into high resolution, and it comes out stunningly beautiful like this. Come on, Jojo. When we do a 2-minute piece with Waldo, it takes the computer 120 hours to create the final picture.
So you could see how Jim went from abandoning the marionette form to adopting the rod and arm technique to going into the remote control animatronic side of things to getting into the 3D animation. Jim was constantly trying to reinvent the form up until the end. And that's what Muppet Vision 3D was. It was a test. It was a test for what the future of puppetry could be. Waldo was a prototype. And the truth is, the Creature Shop to this day is still an extension of all of that, right? So Jim Henson, again, has impacted our culture and entertainment in so many different ways, beyond the obvious, beyond the Muppets, who I love. Jim Henson's legacy should not only be preserved, honored, celebrated, but it should be taught. And if the Walt Disney Company and Bob Iger don't understand the value in what the Muppets represent and what Jim accomplished in his life, then I would argue it's time to get rid of them. And you would have thought after 14 years, you would have had a plan for the Muppets. There should have been a full-on Muppet land, and everything that will become Monsters, Inc. land should have been Muppets. It should be a whole Muppet land. The blessing of size, as Walt always said about Florida. So there's no reason other than not appreciating, not liking, not loving, not understanding. There's no reason to take the Muppets out and to rip out the last thing that Jim Henson did. That is a museum installation in a theme park. And the idea that you are ripping that out without an exit strategy is sinful. It is sinful. Muppet Vision 3D should not be touched, and if it is going to be touched, it should be uprooted and reinstalled somewhere else. Anybody with the slightest understanding would know that the value of what Jim Henson created is far more important than that tiny bit of real estate in the sum of 40 square miles that exists in Walt Disney World, okay? So there was no need to do it. It is not only a complete lack of respect and understanding, but it just shows that you treat the Muppets like something you never wanted in the first place. Disney has chosen to treat the Muppets like nothing more than a gimmick. And I would suggest once again, it's time for Bob Iger to sell the Muppets back to the Henson family. Growing up, the Muppets were a huge part of my life. Jim Henson had impacted my childhood in so many different ways. It was 1989, and here I am in MGM Studios, waiting for my lunch as a little kid when in walks Jim Henson. It was first Kermit, Piggy, Chip and Dale, and I do believe it was the day that they announced the deal with Eisner. And I have a photo, and I have to cross-reference this at some point. But in walks Jim Henson, and in this photo, you see the back of my head. I remember waving to Jim Henson. Jim Henson waved back to me. That was the extent of the interaction, but it touched me from that moment forward, and I never have stopped thinking about it since. Eventually, as a child, I figured out I could talk like Kermit the Frog. And one day I picked up the phone and I called Jim Henson Productions because I left the voicemail as Kermit. They're like, we really like what you have to offer and we would love for you to come join us when you are ready. So I get to college and I wind up interning for the Muppets. Finally, that was where I was first exposed to his film Timepiece, which really does, as one of his earlier works, just speak to his ingenuity as not just a puppeteer, but as a filmmaker, as an auteur, and even as an entrepreneur, because he had his hand in so many different pots and he broke so much ground in his lifetime, in his career. So not only was I exposed to those stories, but I had some fantastic interactions, right? I got to learn how to build puppets from the woman that ran the Muppet Workshop. I was part of the crew that delivered Audrey 2 to the Broadway Theater. I remember building props for Sesame Street, and I would often walk into work and be exposed to random things like, oh, look, there's Elmo interviewing Isaac Mizrahi. So it was a really fun time. In fact, speaking of Elmo, they once had me pick up Elmo in a duffel bag from Kevin McClash's apartment, and I had to take him across Midtown on a bus, and I'm sitting on the back of the bus. Nobody knows Elmo's in the duffel bag, and I'm like, if I took Elmo out of this duffel bag and started doing the voice, I mean, it would be a riot. Now, there was no social media, so I probably could have gotten away with it, but there's just been this personal aspect of what Jim Henson accomplished that resonated through my formative years. So I wind up becoming an intern for the Muppets. I wind up taking Joe Coconut and everything that I learned while I was there and running off with that to Los Angeles, where I got the opportunity to finally audition to be the voice of Kermit the Frog. At this point, Disney had taken over. And while I didn't get that part, I can tell you that the entire arc from having made that call to finally having that audition with Disney, it was a journey for me. It all revolved around Kermit and what Henson had done. And I always thought, oh my gosh, I would love to be the next voice of Kermit the Frog. So that's what Jim Henson means to me. And there's so much more there. There's so many more things that I could tell you about how Jim Henson impacted me personally and just the little Henson anecdotes.
It's interesting that puppets working on television like this, when you're working, you're watching the television set, so you're actually performing and you're being an audience at the same time.
Jim Henson is and will forever just be so important to me. And I'm actually getting choked up saying that to you. So thank you for watching. And thank you, Jim Henson. Thank you, Frank Oz. And I'll see you next time.
It's certainly not a career that one would plan. You know, you wouldn't decide to become a puppeteer, I don't think, in your life.
It's time to spice up your kitchen with Pampered Chef. Pampered Chef has all the goodies from spatulas, mandolins, and amazing pots and pans, not to mention knives. Plus, don't miss out on small appliances like the deluxe air fryer and coffee maker. Spice up your kitchen today. Go to pamperedchef.com/PWS/Colleen Herman. pamperedchef.com/PWS/Colleen Herman. And with no estate plan, you could be leaving those you love the most with high taxes, probate fees, and an incomplete or divided estate and legal fights and fees. If you live in Florida, contact RK Law for a free consultation to discuss the options you have and the tools available to protect your home, savings, and estate for those you love the most. To get started, send an email to russell@rklawpro.com or call 786-566-2456 to set up your consultation today. That's russell@rklawpro.com. And if you're in the market for a 3D printer, visit flashforge.com. With printers starting at under $300, you can begin your 3D adventures today. Visit flashforge.com. And while you're online, head over to Etsy and the Theme Park Factory. The Theme Park Factory on Etsy is a great way to support this channel. Pick up a Joe Coconut and bring a little bit of the Theme Park Factory to your home.